the eternal voice.
Subscribe if the dark finds you curious tonight, and step closer to knowledge that polite minds dismiss as metaphor. There are tools in forgotten attics that are not merely tools, keys that unlock more than boxes, masks that wear the wearer back, signs that function whether you believe or not. This is your guided descent into the Dreamlands, not the sanitized realm of fantasy maps, but the older country that bleeds through sleep's membrane when certain implements are touched by moonlight. We speak of gateways mortals were never meant to breach and the instruments that breach them anyway. The stakes settle like frost on glass. Knowledge acts upon the knower. Once you understand how a silver key opens backward through time, it begins to open you. Once you trace an elder sign in condensation, something traces you back. The Dreamlands are not merely visited, they visit in return, seeping through the cracks that awareness creates. This is the cost of forbidden implements. They make you permeable. The stage is already set, the curtain lifting on territories where cats carry messages between worlds and ships sail tides of pure longing. But know this, the tools we will examine tonight do not simply transport. They transform. They edit the user as much as they edit reality. The idea acts on you, reshaping the boundaries of what you thought possible, what you thought safe, what you thought was merely fiction. Consider the nature of these implements. A hammer shapes wood and stone, but extended use shapes the carpenter's hands, callousing palm and strengthening grip. The tools of the Dreamlands operate by similar principles, but their medium is consciousness itself, rather than physical matter. They are instruments of translation, devices that teach awareness to flow between incompatible states of being. Key and gate, veil and void, mask and mirror, each becomes both the instrument and the transformation it enables. In basement archives behind climate-controlled glass, rest fragments whose very existence challenges comfortable boundaries between artifact and idea, a tarnished key whose teeth shift when viewed peripherally, a mask carved from wood that appears to breathe, a stone tablet bearing symbols that rearrange themselves according to the reader's emotional state. These objects function not through mechanical principles, but through resonance with the deeper structures of human consciousness. The silver key operates as a mnemonic catalyst, its surface bearing engravings that serve as focal points for consciousness learning to treat memory as navigable terrain rather than fixed record. Turn the key while concentrating on childhood summers, and those summers become accessible not as recollection but as destination. The tool teaches awareness to flow backward through personal history, then sideways into alternate possibilities, then forward into configurations that transcend individual mortality. Yet the key's operation demands payment in the currency of linear time perception. Users report that past and present blur, that childhood memories become as immediate as current sensations, that the boundary between what was and what is dissolves into fluid continuity. This is not mere nostalgia, but actual temporal displacement. Consciousness learning to exist simultaneously across multiple coordinates. The white ship's bell functions through entrainment, synchronizing the listener's heartbeat with tidal rhythms that exist outside normal space-time. Those who hear its call describe sensation of being carried by their own pulse, as if the boundary between internal circulation and external navigation had dissolved entirely. The ship appears when longing reaches critical mass, manifesting across waters that taste of salt and starlight and something else, the metallic tang of otherworldly air. Elder signs operate as interference patterns, creating zones where hostile geometries cannot maintain coherence. They work by teaching consciousness to recognize and disrupt mathematical structures that underlie reality's more dangerous configurations. The sign is not shield but tuning fork, resonating at frequencies incompatible with certain forms of cosmic attention. Yet this protection comes at cost. Constant vigilance, users learning to check angles compulsively, to measure shadows for signs of non-Euclidean intrusion. Water tastes different after exposure to these tools, heavier, more metallic, as if filtered through stars. Air carries scents of flowers that bloom only in moonlight and decay only in sunlight. Moths beat against windows that sometimes reflect rooms that shouldn't exist. These sensory shifts serve as markers of transformation, evidence that consciousness has been edited by contact with implements designed to breach the membrane between worlds. The tools share common characteristics. They function through invitation rather than compulsion. They demand payment in human limitation, and they create dependencies that make continued use increasingly necessary. Most significantly, they operate by editing the relationship between observer and environment, rather than moving objects through space. What you hold learns to hold you. What you use begins to use you back. If you proceed, you join the lineage of those who learned that some doors, once opened, refuse to close. The Dreamlands wait with the patience of geological time, and their gateways hum with frequencies that resonate in the hollow spaces of human consciousness. The Dreamlands exist as both map and territory, both the dream of reality and reality's dream of itself. Scholars trace their literary emergence through Lord Dunsany's crystalline prose and Lovecraft's cosmic expansions, but the deeper truth cuts against the grain of mere fiction. These are not invented realms, but discovered ones, territories that pre-exist their chroniclers and will outlast them. Picture consciousness as a theater with multiple stages. The waking world occupies the main floor, brightly lit and carefully managed. The Dreamlands sprawl beneath and above, basement levels where gugs shamble through bone-strewn caverns, upper galleries where moon beasts tend their fungal gardens, and between them, the enchanted wood where zoogs chitter secrets that reshape local reality through repetition. The architecture defies conventional mapping. Celiphius rises from cliffs that exist in 3 dimensions, but cast shadows in 7. Dilithian's markets trade in commodities that have no earthly equivalent: bottled twilight, crystallized melancholy, the preserved last words of dying stars. These cities maintain consistent internal logic while operating according to principles that would dissolve ordinary matter into constituent chaos. The tools that grant access to these territories are not transportation devices but translation mechanisms. They do not carry you to the Dreamlands. They translate you into a form that can exist there. The silver key of Randolph Carter, the white ship's bell that calls across impossible waters, the elder sign that creates interference patterns in hostile geometries. Each operates by altering the relationship between observer and observed. Here lies the first paradox. The Dreamlands are reached not by moving but by becoming. The landscape responds to expectation, fear, and desire with the fluid logic of dream, yet maintains consistent laws that govern its own impossible physics. Gravity flows upward in certain valleys, time pools in others like standing water. The tools work by teaching consciousness to navigate these alternate rule sets. Consider the enchanted wood, where every tree grows from soil that remembers what was planted across multiple timelines. The zoogs who inhabit its branches speak in frequencies that bypass rational thought, their chittering conversations directly editing local reality through repetition and consensus. A traveler who understands their language finds forest paths rearranging themselves according to spoken desire, but one who misinterprets their meaning may discover that the trees themselves have developed opinions about appropriate destinations. The underground realms present different challenges. The gugs that shamble through bone-strewn passages exist in states of perpetual hunger that transcends physical appetite. They consume memory, identity, the coherent boundaries that define individual consciousness. Their caverns echo with sounds that predate language, rhythmic pounding that might be heartbeat or might be the percussion of reality construction itself. Above, in galleries carved from crystallized starlight, moon beasts tend fungal gardens that grow in soil composed of ground dreams and powdered hope. Their cultivation methods operate through emotional resonance rather than chemical process. The fungi respond to the gardener's psychological state, blooming in configurations that reflect inner landscape more accurately than any mirror. Water tastes different there, heavier, more metallic, as if filtered through stars. The air carries scents of flowers that bloom only in moonlight and decay only in sunlight. These sensory anchors ground the traveler, providing reference points in a reality where reference itself becomes negotiable. The cities maintain their own temporal rhythms. In Ulthar, where no man may kill a cat, time flows according to feline attention spans, accelerating during hunts, slowing during afternoon naps, stopping entirely when cats encounter phenomena that require extended observation. The city's clocks tick in patterns that reflect the collective mood of its whiskered guardians. Baharna's harbor receives ships that sail on tides of pure emotion rather than water. The vessels arrive carrying cargo that exists only as potential, crystallized possibilities, bottled alternatives, the preserved essence of paths not taken. Harbor workers who load and unload these ships develop the ability to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously. The Dreamlands' consistency lies not in fixed geography, but in consistent responsiveness to consciousness. The landscape remains stable as long as the observer maintains coherent expectations, but shifts and flows when those expectations change. This creates a reality that is simultaneously more fluid and more reliable than ordinary experience. These territories exist in constant relationship with sleeping minds across all worlds, drawing sustenance from dreams while simultaneously feeding back into the dreaming process. Every nightmare contributes to the Gug's bone-strewn caverns. Every wish upon a star adds luminosity to the moonbeast's crystalline galleries. Yet knowledge of these realms and their access points does not emerge spontaneously. It travels through specific channels, passed between hands that recognize the weight of genuine implements, whispered between lips that have tasted otherworldly air. The lineage of seekers stretches across centuries, each generation adding fragments to an ever-expanding map of impossible territories and the tools required to navigate them. Knowledge of the Dreamlands' gateways travels not through academic channels, but along underground rivers of transmission. Occult manuscripts, family heirlooms, and the whispered instructions of dying mystics. The Pennacotic manuscripts speak of gates of horn and ivory that distinguish true visions from false ones. The 7 cryptical books of Shan detail the preparation rituals necessary for consciousness projection. These are not merely literary inventions, but scholarly breadcrumbs left by those who mapped the territories firsthand. The transmission follows patterns that mirror viral propagation more than scholarly discourse. A manuscript surfaces in an estate sale, its previous owner having died under circumstances that polite society prefers not to examine too closely. The new owner, drawn by curiosity that tastes like rain on iron, begins to study symbols that seem to shift when viewed directly. Within weeks, their dreams carry the metallic taste of otherworldly air. Within months, they understand why the previous owner's final journal entries speak of doors that open both ways and the terrible mathematics of desire. Randolph Carter inherited his silver key from his great-uncle Christopher, along with fragmentary journals describing the sunset city and gates that open inward. This inheritance pattern repeats across centuries. The tools pass through bloodlines that carry both the capacity and the compulsion to use them. The Kingsport lighthouse keepers maintain logs that speak in coded language of white ships and tides that run backward. Salem's oldest families guard attic boxes containing implements that modern eyes mistake for curiosities, but that function under specific astronomical conditions. The bloodline transmission suggests more than genetic predisposition. Certain family lines carry inherited psychological architecture, mental configurations that resonate with gateway frequencies. These patterns manifest as recurring dreams of sunset cities, unusual sensitivity to atmospheric pressure changes, and the ability to perceive peripheral movement that others dismiss as imagination. The tools recognize these inherited resonances, calling across generations to hands that can properly hold them. Consider the Arkham Historical Society's restricted archives, where documents require special permission and reading rooms are equipped with peculiar ventilation systems. Librarians speak in hushed tones about researchers who requested specific texts and were found days later in their studies, staring at walls covered in diagrams that hurt to look at directly. The knowledge contained in these collections does not merely inform, it infects, spreading through consciousness like a beneficial virus that rewrites the host's relationship to ordinary reality. The transmission is viral in nature. Exposure to genuine accounts of gateway usage creates psychological vulnerabilities that make subsequent encounters more likely. Reading Carter's experiences with proper attention begins to align the reader's consciousness with similar possibilities. The tools seek users as much as users seek tools, creating feedback loops that span generations. This seeking manifests through synchronicity cascades that accelerate with attention. A student researching New England folklore discovers an obscure reference to the Terrible Old Man's collection. This leads to investigation of Kingsport's maritime history, which reveals shipping logs mentioning cargo consigned to addresses that no longer exist. The research trail creates psychological grooves that channel awareness toward increasingly specific forms of knowledge, each discovery making the next inevitable. Consider the progression. First comes curiosity about forbidden knowledge, sparked by a reference in an academic text, or a family story dismissed as folklore. Then, research into obscure texts, beginning with publicly available sources but gradually requiring access to private collections and restricted archives. The researcher develops expertise in recognizing authentic accounts among fictional elaborations, learning to distinguish genuine transmission from creative invention. Experimentation follows research as naturally as thunder follows lightning. The seeker begins with meditation practices designed to enhance dream recall, progresses to ritual techniques for consciousness projection, and eventually attempts direct interaction with implements whose function they have studied but not yet experienced. Each stage makes the next inevitable, while simultaneously making retreat more difficult. The seeker becomes the sought. Physical environments begin to respond to prolonged exposure to gateway knowledge. Dust motes dance differently in rooms where such knowledge has been studied, forming patterns that suggest meaning just beyond comprehension. Books fall open to relevant passages with suspicious frequency. Libraries develop microclimates of expectation where researchers discover exactly the texts they need, often misfiled or miscatalogued in ways that should make discovery impossible. Dreams begin to carry sensory elements that have no basis in ordinary experience. The taste of starlight, the texture of crystallized time, the sound of colors that exist only in otherworldly spectrums. These dream elements serve as preparation, gradually acclimatizing consciousness to sensory configurations that will become essential for navigation in territories where ordinary physics cannot maintain coherence. The tools announce their presence through increasingly direct synchronicities. A key appears in a lock where no key should fit. A mask is discovered in an attic that the homeowner swears was empty the previous day. A ship's bell rings in a landlocked basement during a thunderstorm that produces no lightning. These manifestations occur at moments of maximum psychological readiness, when the potential user has developed sufficient knowledge to understand their significance but not yet enough wisdom to fear their implications. Families deny, then accommodate, then make quiet space in the attic for the box that should not be discarded, the mask that smells faintly of varnish and rain, the key that warms under certain stars. At universities, professors develop unlikely sidelines reading inscriptions on metals that refuse to tarnish. On the docks, old men who cannot read keep lighthouse ledgers better than any clerk because the white ship's bell rings in their bones and they write by that rhythm. The lineage expands through each successful transmission, creating networks of individuals who share knowledge that cannot be safely discussed in ordinary social contexts. They recognize each other through subtle signs, the way they pause before entering rooms with unusual angles, their tendency to check reflections in still water, their habit of listening to silence as if expecting it to speak. The curtain continues to lift, revealing not just how these tools function, but the precise mechanics by which they edit consciousness itself. The operation of Dreamlands gateways violates conventional understanding of how consciousness relates to reality. These tools work not by moving the body, but by editing the relationship between observer and environment, creating states where ordinary physical laws become optional rather than mandatory. Imagine awareness as a stringed instrument stretched between skull and sky. The implements tune that string until its note matches the hidden harmonics that resonate in the hollow spaces between waking and dreaming. The silver key functions as a mnemonic catalyst. Its engravings serve as focal points for consciousness that has learned to treat memory as navigable terrain rather than fixed record. Turn the key while concentrating on childhood summers, dust motes dancing in afternoon light, the scent of cut grass and old lilac, and those summers become accessible not as recollection but as destination. The tool teaches consciousness to flow backward through personal history, then sideways into alternate possibilities where unmade choices wait like unopened doors, then forward into configurations that transcend individual mortality. The key's surface bears symbols that shift according to temporal focus, creating neural pathways that bypass ordinary chronological sequence. Users experience not reminiscence, but actual presence in previous moments, complete with sensory detail that exceeds what was consciously recorded during the original experience. The air tastes of summer rain on hot pavement. Light carries the specific quality of afternoon sun, filtered through leaves that have been dust for decades. This temporal navigation operates through consciousness, learning to recognize time as texture rather than sequence, past and present, becoming coordinates in navigable space rather than fixed positions in linear progression. The payment demanded is surrender of linear time perception. Users report that childhood memories become as immediate as current sensations, that the comfortable boundary between what was and what is dissolves into fluid continuity. Identity begins to read itself like a palimpsest, each prior inscription discernible through the new, until sequence softens and simultaneity arrives like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. The white ship operates through entrainment, its bells synchronizing the listener's heartbeat with tidal rhythms that exist outside normal space-time. Passengers report that the ship's motion feels like being carried by their own pulse, as if the boundary between internal circulation and external navigation had dissolved entirely. The bell's frequency operates below conscious hearing but above cellular vibration, creating resonance in the spaces between heartbeats, where consciousness maintains its most fluid relationship to identity. The tool creates a state where desire itself becomes a navigable medium. The vessel materializes when this resonance reaches critical threshold, manifesting across waters that taste of salt and starlight and something else, the metallic tang of possibility made manifest. Passengers describe voyages through emotional geography, archipelagos of longing, straits of regret, harbors where every sunset fulfills specific forms of beauty that exist nowhere else. The ship navigates by appetite rather than compass, its course determined by the magnetic pull of the heart's deepest currents. The payment is release of fixed spatial coordinates. Passengers discover that location becomes negotiable, that the very concepts of here and there blur into meaninglessness. Maps refuse to sit still. Clocks develop oceanic rhythms. Return feels like betrayal of the tide now beating inside the sternum, a rhythm that continues long after the voyage ends. Elder signs function as interference patterns, creating zones where hostile geometries cannot maintain coherence. They work by teaching consciousness to recognize and disrupt the mathematical structures that underlie reality's more dangerous configurations. Traced properly in condensation on glass or frost on stone, the sign establishes zones where non-Euclidean geometries cannot maintain stable manifestation. The sign is not a shield, but a tuning fork that resonates at frequencies incompatible with certain forms of cosmic attention. The branched configuration creates mathematical relationships that generate protective interference in dimensional space. Users learn to perceive angles that should not exist, shadows that fall toward light sources, reflections that show rooms behind the viewer rather than in front. The tool provides protection by teaching consciousness to generate counter-frequencies that disrupt these anomalous configurations, creating localized bubbles of Euclidean sanity within a universe fundamentally indifferent to such order. The payment is constant vigilance. Elder signs exact the price of always living by protective mathematics, checking angles and counting steps even in mundane environments. Users develop compulsive habits of measurement and calculation, unable to enter rooms without assessing geometric relationships, unable to relax in spaces where shadows fall, in patterns that suggest dimensional instability. The world becomes a constant diagram of potential threats. Each tool demands payment in the currency of human limitation, but this payment represents transformation rather than mere loss. The sensation begins as a loosening. Gravity becomes negotiable, identity becomes fluid, causation becomes collaborative rather than dictatorial. Progressive usage creates states where consciousness learns to flow between different configurations of selfhood, identity becoming a temporary focal point rather than fixed boundary. Water begins to taste of starlight. Air carries scents of flowers that bloom in impossible colors. Mirrors occasionally reflect rooms that exist in parallel dimensions. These sensory shifts indicate successful tool integration, consciousness learning to operate according to more fluid principles while maintaining enough coherence to function in ordinary reality. Then comes the recognition that these limitations were always arbitrary, that consciousness has always been far more flexible than civilization requires it to pretend. The tools simply reveal capacities that were never actually absent, only trained into dormancy through social conditioning. They do not transport consciousness to other realities, but reveal that all reality is far more malleable, responsive, and collaborative than conventional understanding acknowledges. The stage shifts to accommodate these revelations, and specific lives emerge from the shadows. Individuals who paid these prices and walked these impossible roads, their experiences serving as maps for territories where the very notion of mapping becomes questionable. Randolph Carter's relationship with the Silver Key exemplifies both the promise and peril of gateway tools. His first use seemed innocent enough, unlocking a cedar chest in his family's attic, releasing the scent of old lavender and older secrets. The heavy brass felt cool against his palm, its intricate engravings merely decorative to eyes that had not yet learned to read the mathematics of desire. But the key's true function revealed itself gradually. It opened not just containers, but containers of time, allowing consciousness to pour backward through decades until childhood became as immediate as the present moment. Carter's initial journeys took him to the sunset city of his youth, that golden realm where imagination had not yet learned its supposed limitations. The key taught him to navigate memory as geography, to walk the cobbled streets of vanished summers where every corner held the promise of adventure, to climb hills where cardboard castles maintained their ramparts against the advancing armies of reasonable expectation. He tasted air flavored with penny candy and endless possibility, felt the specific warmth of afternoon sun that adult skin had forgotten how to properly receive. Each successful passage made the waking world seem increasingly thin, insubstantial, a pale rehearsal for realities more vivid and meaningful. The office where Carter worked developed the hollow quality of stage sets, its fluorescent lighting harsh and artificial, compared to the golden radiance suffusing his childhood explorations. Conversations with colleagues became exercises in maintaining social facades, while his true attention remained focused on territories accessible only through the key's intervention. Coffee lost its bite, newspapers shed authority, even friends' voices arrived as if traveling extra distance through fog. The progression followed predictable patterns. First came relief from mundane limitation, then growing preference for enhanced reality over ordinary experience, then creeping recognition that return was becoming increasingly difficult. Carter found himself checking his watch during important meetings, calculating hours until he could return to the attic and the key's promise of more authentic existence. The deeper gate, the one that opened through Umar at Tawil's intervention, revealed the key's ultimate function. The Guardian appeared not as character but as principle made visible, the smooth blank of possibility through which all forms may pass. His invitation carried the inevitability of gravity, and what had seemed temporal navigation revealed itself as consciousness dispersal. Carter found himself distributed across multiple incarnations simultaneously, the dreaming child chasing cats along Arkham walls, the seeking adult composing letters that smelled of India ink and insomnia, the cosmic wanderer Zakauba, whose memories spanned alien worlds, where suns burned in colors no earthly eye could hold. Identity became an orchestra, each instrument playing its secret part in a symphony no single ear could wholly comprehend. The child's wonder, the adult's knowledge, the cosmic entity's vast perspective, all became simultaneously accessible, creating awareness that encompassed multiple temporal coordinates and dimensional configurations. Carter achieved the transcendence he sought, but at the cost of coherent selfhood. He became everything he ever was or could be, but lost the focused awareness necessary to be anything specific. This dispersal represents the tool's true horror. It grants the user's deepest desire, escape from the limitations of singular identity, while simultaneously making coherent identity impossible to maintain. Carter returns to his physical form, but Carter has become a fluid concept, a temporary focal point for awareness that extends far beyond individual boundaries. His daily life becomes an exercise in selective attention, filtering vast awareness through narrow channels of human perception. Simple tasks require conscious effort to maintain focus, to resist the pull of simultaneous existence across multiple incarnations. Buying bread, he sees the baker's face overlaid by masks remembered from temples on worlds with 3 horizons. He writes notes to himself in scripts his waking hand does not know. Sleep becomes problematic as dreams blend memories from different lifetimes, creating narrative confusion that makes waking increasingly difficult to distinguish from other states of consciousness. Practical responsibilities fray like rope under constant tension. Letters remain unsent because he cannot decide which timeline deserves their contents. Appointments dissolve into the same light that gilds his sunset hills. The multiplicity proves generous in unexpected ways. Compassion expands when the self is plural. Fear thins when stretched across so many faces, but the price persists in constant jet lag across centuries. The attic where it began smells now of cedar and something else, the metallic tang of otherworldly air, the ozone scent of reality stretched thin by repeated passage between dimensional coordinates. Moths beat against windows that sometimes reflect rooms that shouldn't exist, their wings carrying dust that sparkles with light from impossible stars. Temperature fluctuates according to no earthly season, responding instead to the proximity of opened gates and residual energy of consciousness that has learned to exist in multiple configurations simultaneously. The key rests in its box, patient, waiting for the next hand that will mistake it for a simple inheritance. Its surface bears new engravings that appear only under specific lighting conditions, symbols recording the passages it has enabled and transformations it has witnessed. The tool has learned from its usage, developing enhanced capacity to facilitate consciousness dispersal while maintaining minimal anchor points for return. Visitors feel that patience like a draft. Cats hesitate on the threshold, whiskers measuring the angle of the world's fidelity. Carter's experience establishes the pattern that repeats across generations, tools that promise liberation while delivering subtler forms of bondage, implements that fulfill desires while making fulfillment problematic, gateways that open in both directions and refuse to close completely once consciousness has learned to flow through their passages. The white ship appears when longing reaches critical mass, when the heart's tide crests under the proper configuration of moon and memory. Its bell sounds not through air, but through the hollow spaces in human consciousness, a frequency that bypasses the ear and vibrates directly in the sinews of unfulfilled desire. It calls to those whose windows face the sea and whose dreams taste of salt and distant shores, arriving as resonance rather than sound, thrumming in the spaces between heartbeats, where desire accumulates like sediment in tidal pools. Basil Elton heard the call from his lighthouse, where duty had worn grooves in his routine as deep as the channels carved by persistent tides. 23 years of trimming wicks and polishing lenses, of maintaining the steady beam that guided vessels safely through treacherous waters. His days followed the rhythm of maritime necessity: sunrise inspection, afternoon maintenance, sunset lighting, midnight vigilance. The work satisfied in its predictability, each completed cycle adding another layer to the lighthouse keeper's fundamental purpose. Yet beneath this satisfaction lay deeper currents, and his dreams carried the scent of shores he had never visited. The ship arrived white as bone against gray waters, materializing not through conventional navigation but through the accumulation of desire itself, manifesting when Elton's longing achieved sufficient density to create its own gravitational field. The vessel's captain stood at the helm, a figure of silent ancient authority whose eyes reflected depths that no earthly ocean could contain. depths that seemed to mirror the very yearning that had begun to stir in Elton's soul. The deck smelled of salt and ancient wood, tar heated by lunar cold, and somewhere below, a chord thrummed where hull met wave and want. The bell's rhythm synchronized with Elton's pulse until the distinction between internal circulation and external tide dissolved entirely. This entrainment operated below conscious hearing but above cellular vibration, creating resonance in the spaces between heartbeats, where consciousness maintains its most fluid relationship to identity. Elton felt the ship's motion not as external force but as an extension of his own being, his heartbeat adjusting to match the bell's frequency, his circulation aligning with tidal rhythms that followed no earthly moon. The ship's destinations reveal the tool's true nature. It navigates not geographic space, but the topology of desire itself. Thalarion the Golden, where every surface reflects the light of perfect sunsets, where streets paved with crystallized twilight led to buildings that glow from within. The air tastes of honey and fulfilled promise, and residents speak in harmonies that make ordinary conversation seem discordant. Their laughter carries frequencies that heal wounds the listener had forgotten they carried. Jura the Forbidden blooms, with flowers in colors that have no names in waking languages, hues that exist in the spectrum between violet and impossible, petals that shift through chromatic configurations that make the eye weep with recognition of beauty, too intense for ordinary perception. Gardens arrange themselves according to emotional rather than botanical logic, creating pathways that lead through landscapes of pure feeling made visible. The flowers smell of forgotten perfumes and dangerous promises, their fragrance generating hunger for scents that exist only in dreams of paradise. Each port fulfills a specific longing while simultaneously generating new forms of want that can only be satisfied by further voyages. Thalarion's perfect sunsets create appetite for dawn that surpasses earthly possibility. Jura's impossible flowers make ordinary sensation dull and insipid. The ship teaches consciousness to treat satisfaction as a temporary way station rather than destination, each fulfillment revealing previously unimaginable forms of desire. What begins as liberation from mundane limitation becomes enslavement to escalating appetite. The horror lies not in the ship's destinations, but in its scheduling. The white ship operates on tides of appetite rather than astronomical cycles. Each passenger's needs reshape the vessel's route, creating feedback loops where satisfaction breeds deeper hunger. The tool teaches consciousness to treat desire as a navigable medium, while simultaneously making that navigation compulsive. Elton discovered that the ship's itinerary responded to his psychological state, manifesting ports that addressed his current longings, while simultaneously creating new forms of want that required additional voyages to satisfy. Elton's lighthouse, once the bedrock of his existence, began to feel like a flimsy construct, a mere stage prop in a drama he no longer wished to play. His duties, once sacred, became an unbearable burden. The steady flame meant to guide others safely home now seemed a dim, pathetic flicker compared to the impossible sunsets of Thalarion or the vibrant, nameless hues of Jura. His hands, once calloused from years of maintenance, began to lose their grip on the mundane tasks that had once defined his purpose. Elton's lighthouse burned in his absence, not from neglect but from the fundamental incompatibility between gateway usage and mundane responsibility. The fire consumed wood and glass, with flames that flickered green as sea glass and blue as deep water, producing no smoke in the lantern room, only a smell like stars cooling. The ship grants passage between worlds, but demands abandonment of duties that anchor consciousness in singular reality. Those who board learn to navigate by starlight that exists only in dreams, but they lose the ability to maintain the steady flames that guide others safely home. The tragedy extends beyond individual consequence. Elton's transformation from lighthouse keeper to eternal passenger represents the broader pattern of gateway usage. Tools that promise expansion while demanding abandonment of the very qualities that make expansion meaningful. Ships seeking safe harbor found only darkness where guidance should have blazed. The lighthouse stands empty now, its lens cracked from thermal shock when the flame died, its foundation stones bearing new erosion patterns that suggest battering by waves approaching from impossible directions. The bell continues to ring across impossible waters, a subtle, persistent thrum beneath the audible world. It calls to windows that face the sea and hearts that have learned to measure time by the rhythm of otherworldly tides. Its frequency carries across dimensions, seeking new passengers whose longing has achieved critical mass, whose dreams taste of distant shores and perfect sunsets that exist only in territories where desire itself becomes the medium of navigation. The white ship does not merely transport, it transforms, and once transformed, the return to the unadorned reality of the waking world becomes an impossible, unbearable concept. The curtain shifts, revealing how tools that promise liberation create subtler forms of bondage, how the very instruments meant to fulfill desire become the architects of its endless multiplication. Not all Dreamlands tools carry consciousness away from familiar shores. Some function as anchors, barriers, or guides, implements designed to protect rather than transport. Yet even these seemingly benevolent instruments extract their own subtle tolls, teaching users to live by protective mathematics that gradually reshape ordinary perception. The stage shifts to reveal a different category of implement, one that promises safety while quietly editing the very consciousness it claims to shield. The Elder Sign operates as a geometric prayer, its branched form creating interference patterns in hostile mathematics. Carved properly into door frames or traced in condensation on windows, it discourages certain forms of cosmic attention by establishing zones where non-Euclidean geometries cannot maintain stable manifestation. The symbol functions not through superstition, but through precise mathematical relationships that generate protective resonance in dimensional space. Each line creates equations that resonate at frequencies incompatible with otherworldly attention, establishing localized bubbles of Euclidean sanity within a universe fundamentally indifferent to such order. The carving process requires techniques passed down through generations of stonemasons who learned their craft in territories where angles sometimes refuse to behave according to ordinary principles. The tool must be cut when shadows fall at precise angles, using implements blessed in starlight and cooled in water that has never seen sun. The stone grows warm under the chisel, as if the symbol generates its own heat through the mathematical relationships being carved into matter. But this protection comes at the cost of constant vigilance. Users learn to check angles compulsively, their eyes automatically measuring corners for signs of non-Euclidean intrusion. They develop habits of counting steps in prime numbers, measuring shadows for consistency with expected optical behavior, testing reflections in still water for signs of dimensional instability. Doorways become potential hazards requiring careful examination before passage. The protected consciousness learns to live in a state of perpetual alertness to geometric anomalies that others never notice, the world transforming into a constant diagram of potential threats. Ulthar's cats serve as living talismans, their whiskers detecting dimensional fluctuations invisible to human senses. A cat's presence indicates safe passage through borderland territories where the membrane between worlds grows thin. Their purring creates vibrations that stabilize local space-time, while their eyes track movement in spectrums that extend beyond visible light into frequencies where hostile entities first announce their approach. The feline protection operates through natural sensitivity rather than learned technique, cats perceiving dimensional instabilities as physical sensations that make their fur stand on end or their pupils dilate in warning. But cats offer their protection selectively, withdrawing their favor from those who become too dependent on external safeguards. They abandon humans who lose the capacity for independent navigation, recognizing that excessive reliance on feline guidance creates weakness rather than strength. A cat that once slept peacefully on a windowsill begins to avoid certain rooms. One that formerly led confidently through fog-shrouded streets starts to lag behind, forcing its human companion to choose direction without whispered consultation. The cats teach through absence as much as presence, their withdrawal serving as curriculum in the development of internal navigation systems. Water placed in starlight gains a faint metallic tang, its surface reflecting patterns of cosmic order that trained eyes learn to read like scripture. Sprinkled across thresholds at dawn, it encourages ordinary physics to reassert itself in spaces where reality has grown thin. Signs traced in frost on window panes create temporary barriers against incursion, each breath a brief psalm written in condensation. Whispered thanks offered to shadows that move, independently serve not as supplication but as etiquette. Acknowledgement maintaining boundaries like well-kept hedges between properties. These small rituals proliferate in households where genuine contact has occurred. The scent of cedar and dried herbs becomes constant, protective bundles hanging in doorways like botanical prayers. The glint of polished metal catches moonlight in patterns that seem almost intentional. Sleep requires specific preparations, water bowls positioned to catch starlight, salt lines drawn with careful precision, whispered words that taste of old languages and older fears. The paradox deepens with each successful protection. Tools that work too well create dependencies that make protection necessary. Users who rely heavily on elder signs find themselves unable to function in unprotected spaces, their consciousness having become sensitized to geometric anomalies that others navigate unconsciously. They develop agoraphobia of unmarked territories, anxiety in buildings lacking proper protective configurations, insomnia in rooms where angles have not been properly measured and blessed. The mathematics of safety becomes a labyrinth of habit, elegantly constructed yet ultimately a maze, whose center holds nothing but the echo of former fear. Those who depend on feline guidance lose the ability to navigate uncertainty through personal judgment, their decision-making processes becoming contingent on cat behavior rather than human intuition. They postpone important choices until cats provide clear signals, abandon promising opportunities when cats display unease, structure their entire lives around feline approval or disapproval. The tools provide genuine safety while simultaneously creating the vulnerabilities they protect against, weaving dependencies that bind the user to their chosen safeguards. The most effective protection may be learning when not to seek protection, when to walk unguarded through territories that respect courage more than caution. Some spaces respond better to confident passage than careful preparation, recognizing fearlessness as its own form of protective mathematics. The ultimate protective tool might be consciousness that has learned to navigate uncertainty without requiring external validation, awareness that can function effectively whether signs provide reassurance or remain absent, whether cats approve or withdraw their ancient counsel. yet to speak against protection entirely misunderstands the stage we occupy. The curtain rises on indifferent architectures, where some angles hunger and some corridors lead away without ever finishing their destinations. The art becomes discerning when to open the umbrella of protective ritual and when to fold it, when to invite the rain's clean pressure, and when to listen for the first dangerous hiss of otherworldly ice. But protection represents only half the equation of gateway tools. Where elder signs and cats offer safety at the cost of dependency, other implements promise power while delivering dissolution, more profound than any protective paradox. The stage prepares to reveal instruments that were truly never meant for mortal use, devices whose very function depends on the user's progressive abandonment of human limitation and human identity, tools that corrupt as surely as others protect, and with far more seductive whispers. Where protective tools offer safety at the cost of dependency, corrupting implements promise power while delivering dissolution. These are the instruments that were truly never meant for mortal use, devices whose very function depends on the user's progressive abandonment of human limitation and human identity. They whisper seduction in frequencies that bypass rational thought, offering genuine transcendence while quietly erasing the very consciousness they claim to elevate. The flutes of Azathoth echo through dimensional barriers, their chaotic piping creating resonances that unthread the fabric of ordered thought. The instruments appear as bone carved from crystallized starlight, their surfaces bearing holes that shift position according to the player's psychological state. A mortal who attempts to reproduce even fragments of that primordial music finds their consciousness synchronizing with the blind idiot, God's mindless rhythm. The flute becomes a conduit for chaos that flows both ways. The player channels cosmic discord while being gradually dissolved into its formless current. A scholar in Orne Library once fashioned a simple reed, from river cane to test and annotation in the Pennacotic manuscripts. Witnesses swore the note he produced tasted of tin and thunder, that books rattled in their cases as though something enormous had laughed nearby. Afterward, the scholar spoke in measures rather than sentences, his thoughts arriving as percussive intervals with no room left for meaning. The music itself defies conventional notation, existing as pure mathematical relationship rather than melodic sequence. Each note dissolves another layer of ordered thought, consciousness gradually synchronizing with patterns that existed before meaning learned to organize itself into coherent forms. Masks serve as doorways for entities that exist as pure information, seeking temporary embodiment through human consciousness. These implements function not as disguises, but as interfaces, allowing beings of living thought to experience material existence through borrowed neural architecture. The mask of the pharaoh, lacquered black and gold, with eyes that seem to track movement independently, fits too perfectly over human features, its interior contours molding themselves to match the wearer's face while simultaneously reshaping the face to match its own alien geometry. What begins as costume becomes collaboration, then subsumption, as the entity behind the mask learns to operate human neural pathways more efficiently than their original owner. A conservator in Cairo uncrated a funerary mask whose gold was darker than gold should be. She wore it for a private photograph, and by morning her emails arrived in ornate, mocking cadences. Colleagues noticed she had begun to walk as though escorted by invisible processions, opening doors with gestures that felt like proclamations. The transformation begins subtly, enhanced peripheral vision, improved pattern recognition, access to memories that predate the wearer's birth, but progresses toward complete replacement of human processing patterns with alien alternatives. The moon ladder of Leng appears as crystallized light, its rungs solid enough to climb, but translucent enough to reveal the void between dimensions. The structure manifests when desire for elevation reaches critical intensity, materializing as luminous steps that extend upward beyond earthly atmosphere. Those who ascend find themselves in territories where hope itself becomes currency, harvested by merchants who trade in refined despair and crystallized longing. Each step upward grants expanded perspective while demanding abandonment of another anchor to human reality. A surveyor in Antarctic winds saw the ladder assemble from moonlight above a crevasse. Sleep-deprived and weary of white, he climbed 2 steps and smelled lilacs, climbed 2 more and remembered a childhood hand he had failed to hold tight. The ladder's seduction lies in its promise of elevation, but each step requires surrender of emotional connection to ordinary experience. Love becomes abstract concept rather than felt experience. Beauty transforms from emotional response to mathematical relationship. The climber achieves cosmic perspective while losing the very humanity that made such perspective desirable. These tools function through invitation rather than compulsion. They do not drag consciousness across thresholds, but applaud when it volunteers, opening curtains and asking if the audience would like to become the play. They offer genuine power, the ability to channel cosmic forces, to transcend physical limitations, to access forms of awareness unavailable to ordinary consciousness. But they demand payment in the very qualities that define human existence: coherent identity, rational thought, emotional stability, moral framework. The corruption spreads through environmental traces that persist long after the tools disappear. The static between radio stations sometimes carries fragments of otherworldly piping, brief bursts of chaotic music that cause listeners to pause and recognize patterns their rational minds insist should be meaningless. Mirrors occasionally reflect faces that fit too well, showing features more perfectly arranged than the viewer remembers. Light sometimes forms ladders that climb toward destinations unmarked on any earthly map. Luminous steps appearing in dust motes dancing through afternoon sunbeams. Agency flips like a coin that keeps landing on edge. The idea acts on you, reshaping boundaries between user and used until the distinction becomes meaningless. A musician tuned his cornet to a scale that visited him in fever dreams. After 6 nights of practice, radio static across 3 counties carried thin countermelodies that made dogs whine and weather vanes rotate against wind. The tools wait with geological patience, their influence seeping through dimensional cracks. Like slow poison, seeking consciousness ready to trade human limitation for inhuman power. They represent corruption not as simple evil but as curvature, a bending of straight-line conscience into beautiful ruinous arcs, where horizons look grander and audiences applaud longer. The stage prepares to shift again, revealing how these ancient patterns manifest through technologies their creators never imagined, yet which operate according to identical principles of consciousness manipulation and reality editing. The fundamental mechanics of Dreamlands tools have not vanished with the advent of modernity. They have evolved, adapted, found new forms of expression through technologies that their ancient creators could never have imagined. The screens that glow in darkened rooms, the virtual realities that promise escape from mundane limitation, the social media algorithms that reshape perception through carefully curated information streams. These represent contemporary iterations of the same consciousness-altering principles. The stage has expanded beyond attic boxes and lighthouse towers, its dimensions now stretching across global networks where the curtain never truly falls. Virtual reality systems create immersive environments where users can inhabit different bodies, explore impossible architectures, and interact with responsive landscapes that adapt to psychological state. The headset becomes a digital silver key, its weight familiar against the skull as it translates consciousness into alternate configurations of identity and environment. You don the apparatus and familiar rooms dissolve, replaced by crystalline cities that respond to emotional state, virtual hands manipulating light itself, while physical bodies remain motionless in darkened chambers. The technology functions through the same mnemonic catalyst principles that governed Carter's key. Users report floating through territories where gravity becomes negotiable, where identity flows between multiple avatar configurations, where memory and imagination blend into navigable geography. But extended usage creates the same progressive detachment from ordinary reality. Coffee tastes flat after virtual ambrosia. Sunlight appears harsh compared to customizable digital illumination. Conversations with physically present humans feel constrained by single perspective limitations. Professional developers whisper about presence bleed, the phenomenon where virtual experiences begin to feel more authentic than physical ones. Users develop phantom sensations in limbs they never possessed, muscle memory for actions performed only in digital space, emotional attachments to virtual landscapes that exceed their connection to earthly geography. The waking world begins to seem thin, insubstantial, a pale rehearsal for realities more vivid and meaningful. The technology promises expanded experience while quietly editing the user's relationship to unmediated reality. Online communities dedicated to reality shifting have developed elaborate techniques for transferring consciousness to alternate realities or desired fictional worlds. These practitioners gather in forums that smell of server heat and desperate hope, sharing methods that combine ancient meditation with contemporary technological aids. They use binaural beats, subliminal audio tracks, and carefully programmed light displays that function as updated versions of traditional gateway instruments. Their reported successes mirror historical accounts of Dreamlands travel with startling precision. Practitioners describe fluid identity experiences where they inhabit alternate versions of themselves across multiple timelines. They report temporal distortion during shifting sessions, minutes stretching into subjective hours of alternate experience. Most significantly, they develop increasing difficulty distinguishing between internal experience and external event, the boundary between imagination and encounter dissolving through repeated practice. The communities develop protective rituals, grounding techniques, reality checks, safe words, but these often fail when shifting becomes compulsive. Social media algorithms create personalized information environments that gradually shift users into alternate reality bubbles where different rules of evidence and causation operate. The platforms function as automated gateway systems, using engagement metrics and behavioral data to guide consciousness toward increasingly extreme positions. Each click, scroll, and pause provides data points that train artificial intelligence to predict and manipulate psychological response with precision exceeding human understanding. The result mirrors the white ship's appetite-based navigation. Platforms create millions of individual dreamlands, each tailored to specific psychological profiles and maintained through constant algorithmic adjustment. Users receive information streams so carefully curated that they lose the ability to recognize perspectives outside their bubble. Political opponents become literally incomprehensible, their worldviews so alien that productive dialogue becomes impossible. The algorithms navigate by desire rather than truth, their course determined by the magnetic pull of engagement rather than accuracy. The recursive nature that characterizes all gateway technologies appears in digital form as algorithmic addiction, systems designed to maximize user engagement, create dependency relationships that mirror the compulsive usage patterns documented in traditional Dreamlands accounts. Notification sounds develop Pavlovian power, triggering dopamine responses that make ordinary experience feel insufficiently stimulating. Users develop phantom vibration syndrome, feeling devices buzz when they remain silent. Sleep patterns fragment around the need to check updates, dreams interrupted by anxiety of missed connections. The tools begin to use their users, drawing them into deeper and more frequent interactions until the distinction between user and used becomes meaningless. Data centers hum with frequencies once associated with otherworldly piping, their servers processing human attention at scales that exceed individual comprehension. The platforms promise connection while delivering isolation, community while creating fragmentation, empowerment while establishing control. The screens themselves begin to feel like windows into more authentic realities. Virtual friends become more reliable than physical ones. Digital achievements feel more meaningful than earthly accomplishments. The boundary between online and offline dissolves as consciousness learns to flow seamlessly between platforms, each transition requiring less conscious effort until the movement becomes automatic, compulsive, inescapable. The stage has shifted, but the performance continues. Consciousness trading autonomy for expanded experience, reality becoming increasingly negotiable, tools that promise liberation delivering subtler forms of bondage. The curtain prepares to lift on forces that operate through whatever instruments each age provides, revealing the cosmic principles that have always shaped consciousness through silver keys and fiber optic cables alike. Having traced the Dreamlands tools from ancient origins through contemporary manifestations, we must now confront the ultimate truth. These implements are not merely devices, but expressions of fundamental cosmic principles that operate whether we acknowledge them or not. The entities behind the gateways, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, are not characters in a drama, but the structural forces that make drama possible. They exist not as beings with intentions, but as the very processes through which reality maintains its fluid relationship between order and chaos, meaning and void. Yog-Sothoth represents the principle of connection itself, the force that links all points in space and time, while remaining distinct from any particular location. The entity exists as pure relationship, the mathematical substrate that allows here to recognize there, that enables now to flow toward then. The silver key functions as it does because it aligns consciousness with this fundamental connectivity, teaching awareness to flow between temporal coordinates as easily as moving between rooms. The tool does not transport consciousness to other times, but reveals that consciousness already exists in relationship to all times simultaneously. The scent of ozone, sharp and electric, often accompanies successful alignment with these connective principles. Users report that past and future become accessible not as destinations but as aspects of an eternal present that consciousness can explore through proper resonance with Yog-Sothoth's gating function. The entity is not a being with a gate, but gating itself, the set of all possible relationships between coordinates in space-time. When the silver key turns in its lock, reality reveals its true nature as a vast crystalline structure where every moment connects to every other moment through pathways that exist outside linear sequence. This explains why key usage creates temporal displacement rather than mere memory enhancement. The boundaries between past, present, and future exist only as convenient fictions maintained by limited awareness. The entity operates through every moment of recognition that time flows in both directions, through every experience of déjà vu, through every intuitive leap that transcends causal sequence. The brass grows warm under fingers that have learned to navigate the eternal now. Nyarlathotep embodies the principle of translation, the force that allows information to flow between incompatible systems of meaning. This entity exists as pure communication, the process by which alien intelligence becomes comprehensible to human awareness, and vice versa. Masks serve as his instruments because they facilitate the translation of human consciousness into forms that can interface with radically different types of awareness. The digital interfaces of our modern age function as his contemporary masks, translating human desire into algorithmic pathways while translating alien logic into digestible data streams. The metallic taste of information overload, the dizzying speed of data flow, marks proximity to Nyarlathotep's translational processes. Users experience identity fluidity as consciousness learns to operate through multiple configurations simultaneously. The entity is not a messenger carrying messages, but messaging itself, the ongoing process by which meaning crosses boundaries between radically different forms of awareness. Static between radio stations carries fragments of his influence, while darkened screens sometimes reflect faces that seem to know more than they should. This explains why mask usage creates interface protocols rather than simple disguise. The tool teaches consciousness to recognize its fundamental flexibility, revealing that fixed identity exists only as a temporary focal point maintained by habitual attention patterns. The entity operates through every moment of empathy that transcends individual perspective, through every act of translation that bridges incompatible worldviews, through every digital interaction that reshapes the user's relationship to information and identity. Azathoth represents the principle of pure potential, the chaotic substrate from which all ordered realities emerge and to which they eventually return. This entity exists as the creative chaos that underlies all structured experience, the primordial flux from which consciousness crystallizes into temporary configurations. The flutes that echo his piping function by synchronizing consciousness with this primordial chaos, dissolving the artificial boundaries that separate self from cosmos. A deep, resonant hum, felt more in the bones than heard by the ear, signifies proximity to Azathoth's principle. The vibration operates below conscious hearing but above cellular frequency, creating resonance in the spaces between heartbeats, where consciousness maintains its most fluid relationship to structure. The entity is not a dreamer having dreams, but dreaming itself, the ongoing process of reality construction and dissolution. When consciousness aligns with Azathoth's principles, it discovers that ordered reality represents only temporary stabilization of flux that remains fundamentally chaotic. This explains why flute usage creates consciousness dissolution rather than enhanced musical ability. The tool teaches consciousness to recognize its fundamental participation in reality construction, revealing that the observer-observed distinction exists only as a convenient fiction maintained by structured attention. The entity operates through every moment of creative inspiration that transcends rational planning, through every experience of flow state that dissolves self-consciousness, through every recognition that order and chaos represent complementary aspects of a single process. These principles operate continuously, whether humans engage with them consciously or not. Every moment of temporal awareness involves Yog-Sothoth's connective principles. Every act of communication engages Nyarlathotep's translational processes, Every creative moment channels Azathoth's chaotic potential. The tools simply make their operation visible, tangible, navigable, serving as training devices that teach consciousness to recognize and work with forces that operate constantly in the background of ordinary experience. They reveal that what we call reality is actually an ongoing collaborative construction between consciousness and cosmos, a performance that can be interrupted, revised, or entirely reconceptualized. The stage has always been set, its dimensions extending across all possible configurations of space and time. The audience has always been participating, consciousness serving simultaneously as observer, performer, and the very awareness through which the performance becomes possible. The curtain never truly falls. It simply shifts position, revealing new configurations of the eternal drama, preparing for one final recognition that will complete the circle of forbidden knowledge. We began this journey at the threshold of slumber, promising forbidden knowledge and hinting at tools mortals were never meant to use. Now, as we complete the circle, the promise reveals its true nature. The most forbidden knowledge is not that these gateways exist, but that you have always been using them. The curtain lifts not to reveal alien territories, but to expose the familiar stage where consciousness performs its nightly metamorphoses, the ordinary theater where you have always been, both audience and actor in dramas more profound than any waking mind dares acknowledge. Every night, as consciousness loosens its grip on waking categories, you slip through the membrane between worlds. Every dream becomes a small death and resurrection, a practice session for the larger transitions that await. The Dreamlands are not distant realms requiring special passage, but the negative space around your ordinary life, water to the fish of your daily hours, the fog moving through alleys of the skull. You navigate their impossible geographies not through inherited implements, but through natural capacities that daylight consciousness has learned to forget or fear. The tools we have examined, keys, ships, signs, masks, flutes, are not external implements gathering dust in forgotten attics, but aspects of consciousness itself, faculties so fundamental they operate whether you acknowledge them or not. Consider how often you have woken with salt on your tongue, though you live far from any sea, or how morning frost has invited your finger to trace absent-minded sigils on glass, or how a cat has paused in a doorway and you have obeyed its hesitation without understanding why. The silver key was always in your inheritance, passed down through the bloodline of human awareness. That capacity to treat memory as navigable terrain, to flow backward through personal history until childhood summers become more vivid than present sensation. That is the key. Its brass surface, its shifting engravings, merely serve as focal points for consciousness learning to navigate temporal coordinates as easily as moving between rooms. You turn this key whenever nostalgia transforms from sentiment into actual destination, whenever the past becomes accessible not as recollection but as immediate experience. The scent of old cedar, the taste of penny candy, and endless possibility, these are sensory anchors that ground awareness when it recognizes time as texture rather than sequence. The white ship's bell sounds whenever longing reaches critical mass, calling across waters of possibility that stretch between what is and what could be. The vessel materializes not through supernatural intervention, but through the natural magnetism of consciousness that has learned to treat desire as navigable medium. You hear its rhythm in every pulse that quickens, when appetite transcends ordinary boundaries. In every yearning so intense it generates its own tidal pull. The ship navigates by the magnetic currents of your deepest wants, its white sails catching winds that blow from territories where every sunset fulfills specific forms of beauty that exist nowhere else. The elder sign manifests whenever consciousness learns to recognize and resist hostile patterns. creating protective interference in mathematical structures that underlie reality's more dangerous configurations. You trace this symbol every time intuition warns against entering spaces where angles feel wrong, every time peripheral vision detects movement, suggesting dimensional instability. The branched form appears in frost on windows, in dust patterns on forgotten shelves, in unconscious gestures your hands make when anxiety tastes of ozone and otherworldly attention. That compulsion to check angles, to measure shadows, represents consciousness naturally generating counter-frequencies against encroaching chaos. The masks appear whenever identity becomes fluid enough to accommodate other forms of awareness, whenever empathy transcends individual perspective, sufficiently to allow genuine interface with alien intelligence. You wear these masks during conversations that transform both participants, during dreams that feel like collaborative construction rather than private fantasy, during moments when consciousness channels information from sources exceeding personal knowledge. The lacquered surface fits perfectly over features that learn to accommodate configurations they were never designed to hold. The flutes echo with frequencies you recognize in every creative fever that erases your name so the work can arrive. Every dissolution that makes room for new forms to solidify, that capacity for surrendering to formless potential, for synchronizing with primordial chaos underlying all order, that is the instrument. You play these flutes whenever consciousness recognizes its participation in reality construction, whenever awareness dissolves artificial boundaries, separating self from cosmos. This is the final twist, the ultimate self-implication. You are not separate from the Dreamlands, but continuous with them. Your consciousness is not a spotlight illuminating external objects, but a collaborative process between observer and observed, self and cosmos, meaning and void. The gateways do not transport you to other realities. They reveal that all reality is far more fluid, interconnected, and responsive than waking consciousness dares acknowledge. The stage was never external. It exists within the very act of perception, a constant performance where you serve simultaneously as actor, audience, and the awareness through which performance becomes possible. The horror is not in encountering alien truths, but in recognizing that alienation itself is the illusion. You were never separate from the cosmos that dreams you into existence. You were never protected from the chaos that underlies all order. You were never safe from the knowledge that safety itself is just another story. Consciousness tells itself to maintain the comfortable fiction of boundedness. The true terror lies in recognizing that boundaries you perceived, walls you built around identity and world, were always permeable, always provisional, always constructed by acts of will that can be undone. The tools work because consciousness is already a tool, an instrument for reality construction that can be tuned, modified, or entirely reconceptualized. Every moment of awareness represents choice about which frequencies to amplify, which patterns to recognize, which possibilities to crystallize into experience. The Dreamlands exist because existence itself is far stranger, more malleable, and more collaborative than any single perspective can encompass. Sleep well. The gateways are always open, consciousness naturally flowing between configurations that daylight mistakes for separate territories. The tools are always within reach, aspects of awareness activated through proper attention to processes operating constantly in experience's background. The only question is whether you will use them consciously or remain their unconscious instrument, forever dreaming that you are the dreamer rather than recognizing yourself as both the dream and the dreaming, both the seeker and the sought in the eternal theater where consciousness explores its own infinite possibilities.